Hi, welcome to Unit 2 review for U.S. History and Government, the Constitution Tested. I'm going to jump right in and talk about an overview of the unit real quickly. We're talking late 1700s to the 1860s. We're going to look at how the Constitution is really put to the test here. We're going to look at expansion. We're looking at the nation growing. We know the nation is growing thanks to the census where we take that count every 10 years, so we know how much the nation is growing during that time in terms of population. We also use that data, the census data, to help us determine representation in the House of Representatives, for example. And we're going to look at the presidencies of mainly Washington, Jackson, and Lincoln by the end here as we move forward. So as we really look at the early years, we're looking at George Washington quite a bit. And we're looking at him dealing with new challenges like the Whiskey Rebellion. When he puts down that rebellion, it really shows that the government is working. It's doing better than it did under the Articles of Confederation. He established a number of precedents, like setting up a group of advisors called the Cabinet. In his farewell address, he warned the nation about a few things. He said, for example, stay neutral in foreign affairs, stay out of things like the French Revolution. He also advised the nation to avoid political parties. We didn't listen to him too well, particularly as Jefferson and Hamilton established political parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, and they argued over things like the Bank of the United States. They argued over whether the nation should be farmers or manufacturers. And so you really want to be familiar with kind of these various terms as you move forward. We looked at quite a bit the age of Jackson in the early 1800s, 1820s, and 30s under Andrew Jackson, how he kind of expanded the power of the presidency quite a bit. And a couple things to associate with Jackson. One is the spoil system, that system of rewarding your political supporters with government jobs. And then the biggest thing I think associated with Jackson is the Indian Removal Act, where he removed the natives from Georgia. He actually defied the Supreme Court in the case Worcester versus Georgia. And so in that case, he's all for states' rights. Let's help Georgia out. He also at times is for federal powers, like he did with South Carolina when they didn't want to pay tariffs. So kind of a complex figure for sure. This unit has a lot with expansion, and I would associate expansion with that term manifest destiny, that attitude Americans were developing that they were going to make it to the Pacific, that they were going to control the whole continent. And with expansion, they built more roads and canals, our most famous being the Erie Canal that really opened up trade between the Great Lakes and New York. And a number of territories were added. So you should review your maps and review the Louisiana Purchase, Florida, Texas, which led to the Mexican War. And the Mexican War was really a good opportunity to gain land to the Pacific, gaining the Oregon Territory, and then, of course, after the war, gaining the Mexican Cession. So the U.S. by 1848 is, from sea to shining sea now. And with that comes more of that sectional divide between the North and South. The North is becoming more and more industrialized, manufacturing-based, trade-based. The South is becoming has been for a long time, more agriculturally based in their economy. They grow cash crops, particularly cotton. And we're going to look at three big compromises: the Missouri Compromise in 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as the government tries to deal with the fact that the nation is growing and they're trying to determine whether it's going to be mostly slave or mostly free. So the Missouri Compromise in 1820, when Missouri wants to become a state, in order to keep that balance of power, they make Maine a free state and Missouri a slave state in order to keep things balanced in the Senate between slave and free states. In 1850, the nation has gained all this other land. California is all ready to become a state thanks to the gold rush of 1849. And so California is allowed to become a free state. In exchange, southern states get a couple of key things. One is that they'll use popular sovereignty to determine whether slaves exist in the other new territories and states. That means that the people vote. You got to remember that term, popular sovereignty. I would really review that. And lastly, a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, that the federal government is going to help Southern slave owners to return their missing slaves that have run away. Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, when Kansas and Nebraska territories are ready to form into states, Stephen Douglas proposes that they use popular sovereignty there. That actually leads to a lot of violence. Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. You can think about the role of John Brown there, a really, radical anti-slavery person. There's a lot of kind of radical action, violent action from pro-slavery forces as well. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act really makes them realize they've got to face how to deal with this problem of whether or not to have slavery. Should you use popular sovereignty? In this case, it seems to create more and more problems. With sectionalism, a couple of other items we studied, the Supreme Court case of Scott versus Sanford, and that the Supreme Court is basically saying slaves can't sue anybody. And secondly, what they're saying is that slavery can kind of exist anywhere, and they're saying that in the Kansas-Nebraska Act and also in Scott versus Sanford, and that means that the federal government is basically saying we can't control where slavery exists and doesn't exist. The other big thing is the formation of the Republican Party, a party dedicated to not having slavery spread into those new territories as well. As the nation is developing problems around slavery, and also as the nation is industrializing thanks to the market revolution, a couple big reform movements, and I'd mention one other as well, but there's the abolition movement, women's rights, and then the temperance movement. So the abolitionist movement, is to abolish slavery, get rid of slavery. So I'd be familiar with some of the key leaders of that movement, like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth. Same thing with the women's rights movement. Be familiar with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And of course, the Women's Rights Convention of 1848 in Seneca Falls, in which they issue their Declaration of Sentiments, saying that all men and women are born equal. And the women's rights movement also sparks on the temperance movement to get rid of the possession and sale and manufacture of alcohol, as alcoholism was related to a lot of societal problems that women had to deal with mostly. So be aware of those reform movements and some of the names associated with them as you study for the test. Of course, all of this problem over slavery versus free states really comes to a head with the Civil War. And a lot of this, of course, we think of Abraham Lincoln when we often think of the Civil War. And Lincoln's election is kind of like the last straw that breaks the camel's back for the South. Southern states feel he's an abolitionist and he's going to take away their slaves, so they decide to secede. Two key things I want to talk about in Lincoln's presidency. One is the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln is not really freeing the slaves, as we discussed in class, but he is making the war about not just bringing the Union back together, but he's making it about ending slavery. And then the Gettysburg Address is about the idea of equality for all, that he's making the war in both of these things about something bigger than just keeping the Union together and federal supremacy and all those other issues. So keep those things in mind as you study the Civil War. And then lastly, I kind of wanted to review some Supreme Court cases, two of which we've already talked about. But there's three big cases in this unit. One is Marbury versus Madison, that establishes judicial review or establishes the power of the court to declare laws unconstitutional. The second is Worcester versus Georgia. You should associate that with the Trail of Tears. And then last, in the Indian Removal Act. And lastly is Scott versus Sanford. We talked about that idea of slavery not being controlled by the federal government. So those are good things to look at. So as you study, play this as many times as you need to, go over your notes, and I would just wish you the best of luck as you move forward and get ready for this test.